are going to close with a session to further explore the issues that Craig has just laid out, to really evaluate where real value can come from for Bitcoin and blockchain in terms of what we believe real utility. So we're going to bring to this stage 2 more in-person panelists, and then we have 1 special remote panelist as well. Let's bring out, you know him already, George Gilder, the economist, writer, investor, and technology visionary. Yeah, give him a round of applause. And joining him is from Cornell University, Eswar Prasad. Thank you, Eswar. Where's George? George is somewhere here. I just saw him. Thank you. Eswar is the Talani Senior Professor of Trade and Policy and Professor of Economics at Cornell. And we're going to bring to our virtual screen someone many of you probably have seen online. He is a crypto economist analyst at the Crypto Vigilante. Please welcome Rafael LaVerde. There he is, George Gilder. He wanted to make a dramatic entrance. So, let's start by asking each of the panelists what their reaction is to Craig's speech and his statement that Bitcoin is an informational commodity. And before we get further, one caveat I'd like to explain, especially for Eswar and George and Rafael, is obviously there's debates in the Bitcoin world about which is the best form or truest form of Bitcoin, and the Bitcoin network has split. Here, since this is a BSV conference, the easiest way sometimes to keep things separate is to identify things by their ticker symbol, BTC and BSV, because when people start throwing around the word Bitcoin, it can mean different things to different people. So let's start with George.
Not when it goes to record, it won't.
Yeah, I know. George, what's your reaction to Craig's argument that Bitcoin is an informational commodity?
It's a suitable instrument for economy of teranodes in metaverses. In other words, it has unlimited possibilities. It's not something you hodl to hide from the world. It's something you use to engage in the world and open new opportunities for people everywhere. That's really the message. It's part of an economy that I describe. Wealth is knowledge, growth is learning, and money is time. And Craig understands it's about time.
Yes, it is about time. George, do you believe that information value is sufficient to give Bitcoin its value?
Well, I think Bitcoin, the right Bitcoin, the open-ended Bitcoin that SV defines,
could do
but
that.
Bitcoin considered a way to flee from the world economy, to protect yourself from runaway central banks, is not the right concept. It does that, but it really is creating a new economy. It's not hiding from the perils in the existing economy.
So, Eswar, you are new to this space of the BSV world. First, why don't you introduce yourself and what you do, and then I'll ask you a few questions about your reaction so far.
So I'm a professor of economics at Cornell University and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. And perhaps one reason I'm here is that I just published a book called The Future of Money, How the Digital Revolution is Transforming Currencies and Finance. Although I suspect I have slightly different ideas about that than the 2 gentlemen I'm sitting next to.
Yeah, and that's okay, and that's why we invited you here. So I don't know how much you caught of Craig's speech right before this, but what is your reaction to his argument that Bitcoin can get its value by being an informational commodity?
So first of all, it's interesting that I'm between a true believer and someone who was present at the creation, although I certainly expected Dr. Satoshi to be a demure, polite Japanese gentleman rather than what I have
rather
here
than
before
a
me.
rude Australian.
I'm sorry, I'm Australian.
All right, close enough. I think when we think about money, we really need to think about what functions in place. And Dr. Wright did talk a little bit about what those functions might be. And what the real value of Bitcoin is going to be, I think, is really about the architecture it provides. Now, he spoke about the ledger aspect, which is certainly very important. But if you think about what money enables, it is transactions among individuals across space, but also across time. And that's where the store of value aspect arises. So the question is whether something like Bitcoin that provides transactional services can have intrinsic value when it's not performing well in that function. Now, it seems to me that the architecture that underpins Bitcoin is remarkably powerful. I think it's going to have really revolutionary effects. But when I think about BTC by itself, I have some questions about where the intrinsic value comes from, because the technology that BTC has spawned is essentially going to give us the ability to undertake these transactions, but you don't really need BTC for that. So BTC initially was the tool or the conduit through which the technology sort of manifested itself. But as Dr. Wright pointed out, N-chain seems to be doing too much of this. I think what is really going to be transformational is the ability of financial pioneers to use the technology in a way that you can make it really sing. And there is a fundamental need in this world for better financial products and services, for better payment technologies, both domestic and cross-border. So I think in terms of payment technologies, there is a fundamental transformation coming. But I don't think cryptocurrencies, however you define them, and I fully acknowledge the point that Dr. Wright made, that cryptocurrencies are not really about cryptography, so perhaps we should find a better name for them.
Digital cash.
Digital private currencies. When I think about the competition between them and fiat currencies, I think about what it is that backs a currency. And ultimately, it's a matter of faith. It's a matter of trust. And in the long arc of history, we've had competition between private currencies. Some of those private currencies folded, and then they competed with government currencies. The creation of central banks ultimately put an end to private currencies. And now, thanks to BTC and its others of its ilk, we now have competition between privately issued currencies and fiat currencies. I'm an economist. I think competition is a very good thing. This is going to definitely result in a better financial system. But I think ultimately, governments are going to win out when we think about money in its store of value function, because ultimately, governments still have the power to levy taxes. They have the power to define legal tenders. And so I think what we're going to see really is a bifurcation of the roles of money, with the sort of technology that BTC has spawned, giving rise to a very efficient mediums of exchange. But I don't think there is going to be a fundamental transformation coming yet in terms of stores of value.
Let's go to Rafael. So Rafael, I know you have some strong opinions about this. Tell us what your reaction is to Craig's speech, and then also how it affects your views of this whole BTC versus BSV version of Bitcoin and value.
Wow, so we only have like 40 minutes for this, because I can talk about this for hours, guys. First off, thank you guys for putting this event together. I would like to say that Bitcoin in its original design is the most misunderstood aspect of all of crypto. It really is, in my opinion, the most beautiful thing in all of crypto. It is for me, it's a magnificent economic symphony of incentives that are aligned. And so when we talk about, I think it was Dr. Prasad that just mentioned, Bitcoin's this, and George Gilder said, Bitcoin's that, and Bitcoin's for working along with government, and others would emphasize, well, actually, Bitcoin is for freeing the market. I think we're talking past one another. Bitcoin is both and. Bitcoin is bigger than many of us can even comprehend. Bitcoin is such a big deal. When I speak about Bitcoin, I'm speaking about Bitcoin in its original design at scale. I'm speaking about the Bitcoin that I fell in love with. Bitcoin in its totality. Right now, BSV. And so when you ask me about BTC, the only thing that I see in relation to Bitcoin in BTC is that it's still using the Bitcoin miners, and unfortunately, they are kind of like being malnourished there, as we very well know. And it's only inevitable that the economic incentives will logically lead miners towards more profitability. And it's up to us to make sure that we build on Bitcoin's original design at scale. And it feels as if for the first time in all of Bitcoin history, Bitcoin is finally waking up. And I'm really happy to be here, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's about time for Bitcoin to wake up. Craig, you addressed this a bit in your speech about what a store of value is. So the BTC narrative by its supporters now is that it's become digital gold and a store of value, and we would argue that's because of the almost like a retroactive narrative because they have chosen not to scale and done other things.
Well, they change the narrative every week.
Yes, that's I know. Yes, we see that. So where do you think BTC is getting its market value from now? And do you think it's a Ponzi scheme? I know you've got some strong opinions about that.
Oh, no, I think there's actually value in there until after the court cases later this year when people realize that value is not there. The value, I mean, the fentanyl dealers in China, there's 3 of them with between, depending on the fluctuation of price, 4 and 5 billion US. The people smugglers, they all think that their money's safe. Because if they have it in a bank or if they've got a big pile of something, that's hard. But they can walk around with this stuff, and they can put it in a hidden area. And like I was having a conversation about Ross Albrecht the other day, and the addresses he has have received another $8 million after the seizure, which technically is his. So they think that. They think that they can't have it taken. And money that you can't take for a criminal is incredibly valuable. But guess what? They're wrong. You can't take encrypted things, but Bitcoin's not like that. But store of value is easy. If we can do millions of transactions a second in the future, and we will, then a central bank digital currency on a single sat can print different denominations. The way that we're talking about this is you have a 1 cent, a 2 cent, a 5 cent, a 10 cent, a 25 cent quarter if you want, a $1, $2, $50, and you print digital notes. And with those digital notes, just like everyone else in the world has done, off you go.
George and Eswar, how would you react to Craig's argument that if an asset such as BTC is volatile in price, that it really isn't a store of value?
Well, I think that the crucial law of capitalism is that you can only keep what you're willing to give away. You have to be willing to invest. So that's why savings and investment are an identity across an economy. You can only keep what you're willing to give away. And that's the crucial value of money. It's that it is shared with others who create with it. And the great contribution of Bitcoin is to return the world to real money again for the digital age. In the past, money was not a government instrument. It was gold. And gold imparted the measuring stick that defined money. And this was Isaac Newton's greatest contribution in my belief. I believe that just as important as his invention of physics, essentially, was his invention of money, his alchemy through which he proved that you couldn't counterfeit gold, you couldn't hack gold. And the reason gold was money is because money is time, and the time it takes to extract a single ingot of gold hasn't changed for centuries on end. As more technology and capital is applied to the mining of gold, the loads to be mined become more diffuse and distant, and people start mining slag heaps and contemplating mining meteors and the moon. Gold has retained an essential stability of the time it takes to extract additional ingot. And similarly, Bitcoin is based on this time measure. It's not an exact time measure. If you try to make it too exact, then it defies relativity and incurs problems. But it's essentially the 10-minute time sequence is the cadence that renders Bitcoin an appropriate representation of tokenized time that allows you to incorporate in every transaction across the economy that essential property that constrains all human activity, and that is the passage of time. It's what remains scarce when everything else grows abundant.
Right.
Time remains scarce. The speed of light, the span of life is the
Lifespan.
constraint.
Yeah, it's about time. Eswar, how do you react to this argument about BTC not being really a store of value given its volatility in price?
I will speak in less lyrical and grand terms than George. I'll make it much simpler. When I think about money, a currency, first of all, one question is whether it has intrinsic value. The notion of BTC was that it would serve, in some ways, as a trustless medium of exchange. And it doesn't work terribly well in that function because it doesn't have the traditional properties of an effective medium of exchange, at least until the Taproot upgrade comes on board. You don't have enough scalability on the BTC network right now to process a large volume of transactions. You don't have very stable value relative to the unit of account, which in this economy is still the US dollar. And as Dr. Wright himself pointed out, you guys are not doing enough to make BTC work as well as it probably could. So if it's not intrinsic value that is driving the fundamental value of Bitcoin, one has to think about this in terms of what determines the value of anything, which is supply and demand. On the supply side, there is scarcity. There is going to be a limit to the number of Bitcoins that are produced, just like with gold. There is scarcity because of the constraints in terms of how much you can mine and how much of the stock there might be under the ground. But as an economist, I ask myself, if something doesn't have intrinsic value, if at least gold, you can use it for your tooth fillings, you can use it for industrial uses, but certainly the market value is a lot greater. So where is the demand coming from? Ultimately, this is a matter of investors believing that it is an asset that is going to maintain value. This is similar to what happens with gold. It has a value that is very disconnected from its intrinsic value, largely because of its scarcity and the belief that it will preserve its value. So this becomes a difficult issue as you think about the potential vulnerabilities that exist in BTC, as Dr. Wright himself pointed out. Many of the attributes that BTC adherents seem to ascribe to it are not necessarily correct in terms of what it can provide for you in terms of true digital anonymity and a variety of other characteristics. So I worry that this foundation is really a bit shaky. But if in fact there can be these upgrades to the network, if in fact the BSV network can actually generate the sort of value that I think it is capable of, then you can see something like BTC really gaining much more intrinsic value, which starts undergirding its fundamental value. So a store of value is not really necessarily one that perfectly keeps its value from one period to the other. But ultimately, it has to maintain most of its value, and it has to be something that there is broad trust in. And maybe this is a flaw of the financial system that we are in today. You might think, BTC can be issued only up to a certain quantity. Fiat currencies can be issued at will. So why on earth does the dollar still have any value? I think what is very important is the ability of a central bank actually to produce the money that a financial system needs at times of crisis, which actually makes that money very valuable. So in my view, it is the infinite elasticity of a fiat currency like the dollar that really keeps its value, because when times are crazy, that asset can be provided in large and liquid quantities. That too is a little bit fragile because it rests on faith in the central bank. And so far, that faith seems to have held up.
Yeah, but we also here think that the foundations of BTC are pretty fragile. So,
I'm just going to quickly interject and say, well, BTC is not actually Bitcoin, and it didn't start at the beginning. It's a copy that is passing off from 2017. So, as a creator, when I said it doesn't change, that means I get to say it doesn't change. So, going out there,
what doesn't change?
The system. If I say I make a contract and say it doesn't change, that's it. It's a commodity. So it's not about whether it can be changed. And Taproot's not about scaling. Taproot doesn't scale at all. Taproot is about hiding transactions. The thing they hate is that I have a completely traceable money system. And Taproot is one more step in losing transaction records. It actually slows down transaction rates. It actually makes it more difficult. So the transaction volume of Taproot, it will be less, not more.
So the okay, sorry, go ahead. So yes, the confidentiality and the requirements of that will certainly slow things down, but my impression was that the Taproot upgrade would also involve changes in the consensus protocol that would actually help move things along much more quickly.
No, the consensus protocol has nothing to do with moving. The 10 minutes is not about any of that. The 10 minutes is sort of finalized broadcast settlement.
Of the blocks, yeah.
And if you're doing it right and you have the small world network set up, then the visibility means that someone can see the double spend instantly. And it's the first transaction. And so if I see transaction 1 and then 80 nanoseconds later I see a second transaction, I know I've been cheated. So as a merchant, if I am making a cup of coffee, I've never seen anyone, especially in London, make me a cup of coffee quickly. So I'm talking 5 minutes. So there's no way on earth that if you can do it in 80 nanoseconds, that I'm worrying about my coffee not being paid for.
Well, Eswar, to address that foundational question, that's what we're doing with BSV, which is finally scaling bigger blocks, huge transaction capacity, big data capacity, so you can handle not just tens of thousands one day, we think millions of transactions a second, and much of the world's data, so that we have a more useful network than what BCTC's done with its capacity limits. How would you react to that as the basis for value in a digital token?
That would certainly enhance the value, because if you think about where the intrinsic value is coming from, if you get to a point where the network can handle a much larger volume of transactions, and I agree with Dr. Wright that the confidentiality should not be the key part of it. In fact, I think ultimately you're going to need to have the government backing this up so that you have legitimacy, because I think the legitimacy can actually help. And this has been a theme of some of your earlier panels as well, that you need to make sure that this doesn't get corrupted by individuals who want to use it for illicit or nefarious purposes. So actually trying to scale up the transactions, trying to open it up some more may actually work in the right direction. And perhaps in that context, the Taproot upgrade may actually not be the right way for this to move, if in fact it's going to give you more confidentiality.
Well, it's not even confidentiality. I mean, you have confidentiality by splitting transactions, not reusing addresses, but it's completely removing the audit trail, which goes back to e-gold and e-cash, which is what they really wanted. Unfortunately, right when I sort of left because of personal problems, all these people came from the collapsing e-gold world into Bitcoin, and they thought that it was different. And then they've brought their ideas, because Silk Road, etc. But it's really simple here. The government can stop that. If you don't have on-ramps, if you don't have US dollar on-ramps, if you don't have ways to pay the electricity, then things go away. So everyone's sitting there going, we can make it anonymous. And the government can go, I can stop you.
So by e-gold and digital cash.
A key, though, is not anonymity. It's attestation. What Bitcoin enables is if the government comes to you and challenges your story, says you're embezzling, says you're avoiding taxes, makes any such claim, you have an immutable ledger to cite. So it allows you as an individual to provide attestation for your behavior. And that's a crucial contribution. It's
And that's where George is right. I mean, if you're running a coffee shop and you get tainted money and you do it for a coffee, but there's no notification, and the alert key would have made that quick for that nanoseconds, and that can be put back in at any time. The government can say, alert key, done. Now, the simple bit here is, imagine that you've received that money. As you know, goods and services without knowledge, there's no notification that this is tainted money, no alert. You sell the coffee. All you need to do is say, here's my record of selling a coffee. Here's the record of getting it. I didn't do KYC because, well, it's only $5.50. This is New York. And there you go.
Okay. Let's let Rafael get a word in, but before we do, when Craig was referring to e-gold and DigiCash, he's referring to prior attempts to create a digital currency or private money that preceded Bitcoin and failed for the reasons that Craig articulated. Rafael, let's get a word in from you. So you've heard a lot of discussion here, and you're a crypto economic analyst for Crypto Vigilante. I mean, how do you try to explain this to your readers and the people you work with about whether all these different coins that are out there have value compared to what you want to see with BSV?
Okay, so let me break this down real quick for the sake of time. Dr. Wright is correct. Bitcoin was never meant to be a privacy coin. Bitcoin is a transparent ledger. It is an honesty machine. A lot of people misunderstood that. And yes, they did try to turn Bitcoin into what Bitcoin was not. And they ended up with these, what I call monstrosities, right? Bitcoin Cash, BTC, where you don't even have what their end in mind was, which was a privacy coin. There was a group of people that did understand that in order to achieve a privacy coin, if someone needs it, and I'm speaking of the individual that finds himself in a situation like a 1930s Germany, where your government has gone rogue and you're dealing with a totalitarian regime and you need to run away, and this was really their motivation, to have an escape hatch from that. Well, there we have the creation of the crypto note protocol, which now is Monero, right? But that's because that satiates a need in the market for which Bitcoin was not created for. Bitcoin was created in its original design to be a transparent global ledger to keep everyone, quote unquote, accountable. I like to emphasize even keeping bureaucrats and governments accountable. Not just a law for me and not for thee. I'm emphasizing a more Bastia approach to all of this, right? It's Bitcoin in its original design is a true Byzantine fault-tolerant system where no one has an advantage over anyone else. Not even a government would have an advantage over the individual. So, and that is what I find beautiful about this, because we actually can have a rule of law based on this magnificent design of that is Bitcoin, Bitcoin in its inception, Bitcoin in it at scale, what we have in BSV.
Let's hone in on this honesty, transparency point, because it's one we make a lot. How much is that important to driving real value in a digital coin such as Bitcoin was meant to be? George, Eswar?
Well, it seems to me that we're in the midst of a crisis here. It's not just the crisis of internet hacking, it's the central bank hacking of currency constantly. The biggest industry in the world economy, as I said yesterday, is not food, it's not fuel, it's not shelter, it's currency trading. $8 trillion a day, $8 trillion every 24 hours of currency trading bespeaks a runaway debauchery of money at the hands of central banks around the world. And Bitcoin is the solution to this scandal of money that afflicts the world today. We do not have money. We have no interest rates. We have no price signals. Bitcoin is about restoring the money as a measuring stick rather than as a magic wand for central bankers.
Okay, my view is slightly less apocalyptic. I think the transparency that is accomplished through what Bitcoin has brought is really remarkable. The fact that we get to see the transactions in all their glory for the entire world to see, the fact that you can use those ledgers, not just for basic payment transactions, but for much more sophisticated, more complex transactions, that I think really brings things out much more into the open. That I think is going to be the fundamental value of the technology. So whatever my comments about Bitcoin as a store of value and so on, I think the technology is really going to be transformational. And I think that transparency really accomplishes a lot of things. It's going to generate a lot more faith in the system as people get to understand how valuable this transparency is. In addition, I think it is going to help governments also come to terms with the fact that you now have competitors to fiat currencies, at least in their roles of mediums of exchange. So I think it's going to be a lot easier, especially once the malefactors at the periphery of the community start realizing that they cannot use this for their illicit ends. So I think trying to get this message across that actually undergirding this could be a set of regulations that actually provide a good interface between what I would think of as the rule of law, the property and contractual rights that are managed by the government, but using Bitcoin and the blockchain technology as a tool for delivering more effective ways of managing that rule of law. I think that's where the real value will come from. So then one has to think about what tokens or how one can monetize that value. That I think is a different discussion altogether, and that gets into questions about whether Bitcoin will persevere as a store of value or not. But the technology part, I think, is where the real value lies.
Yeah. So we've now started introducing the issue of central banks into this conversation. I want all of your reaction to what's happening in El Salvador with the government there, declaring Bitcoin, and as we see right now, it's really just BTC in their view, being treated as legal tender. What's your reaction to that?
Well, it's not really legal tender. I mean, if you read the rule, it's sort of a hybrid type system. Mm-hmm. So what I would say there is, and it's not even Bitcoin, it's promissory notes on Lightning.
Correct, yeah.
So what we have is...
The rule doesn't say that, but it's how it's being implemented.
We have the ideal sort of Panama paper money, which is there are a number of rich government officials who have no way of getting US dollars out of the country until now. And basically, like certain Prime Minister of Malaysia and other things like this, where billions start just disappearing from their governments, this is what we're going to start seeing.
Rafael, what's your reaction to El Salvador's situation with Bitcoin?
I think it's a good step in the right direction. It's kind of funny how Shiva Wallet centralizes all of their liquidity. So much for decentralization, right? Yeah. It's almost as if Satoshi had not created the small world network that we talk about here. And the beautiful wallet architecture that allows us for, Section 2 of the white paper and Satoshi's privacy model, Section 10 of the white paper. It's almost like no one read it. It's weird, but I digress.
I think people
Overall,
don't read
it's a good step in the right direction. Pardon?
I said I think people don't read the white paper.
Well, it's almost like, you can read it, but you also have to understand that you have to extrapolate logically what that would mean for Bitcoin at scale. Mm-hmm. Does that make sense? I don't see it as a static thing. It's the base rules set, and given the progress of computer science, I mean, for example, Section 10 of the white paper is something I would love to sit down with Craig Wright over a beer and talk about, because my imagination just goes wild thinking about Section 10 on its own, the privacy model for Bitcoin. I mean, that's just outstanding. But in terms of central banks, I think that they're going to have a real hard time because in order for them to implement their digital currencies, they would have to disintermediate the commercial banks. And I don't think that that's within their, that's not aligned with their own personal incentives. As the central banking cartel composed of these same commercial banks. So disintermediation of the banks is not something that we're going to see. I actually think we might see more of a JP Morgan coin, that type of attempt. But all of those attempts are going to be trite. Once people realize what Bitcoin was truly created for, and it's just so mind-boggling to me that Bitcoin is so misunderstood still. But I'm really happy that we're doing things the right way, that we're actually showing that Bitcoin in its original design works via proof of work. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be competing for sure.
Yeah. If I can just interrupt, what I'd say for your bit on section 10 is what you need to imagine is that this is both a space complexity and time complexity problem, where if you start having multiple inputs and you make small amounts, like we could actually break this down and you can be the old woman who has 5-cent pieces, but instead of counting them, the computer does it really fast. So I can pay my $180 grocery bill with 5-cent pieces that quickly. Now, imagine that goes to $180 worth of 5-cent pieces in sort of deposits to the other new addresses every time that are calculated to be linked with identity. And what we have is now something that becomes more and more complex over use, but is still a one-way function. Because I don't know if you know, but there are cryptographic signature schemes that are based on graph, select graph functions. And what we end up with is, if you try and follow when you know something, so law enforcement, if they have all the things to go, this is the bad guy, this is his key, can follow all the transactions, once they have done the work. So none of this computerized stuff, back to human intelligence, HUMINT. On the other hand, if you're out there and you want to go, where did that money go? You have no hope. We're talking second by second, billions of transactional multiplications, and it actually becomes more complex than ECDSA itself. So
I actually have the white paper on the reading list for my students in my class, so they have to slog through it and we work through it together.
Thank you. Good.
It's a foundational paper in some ways. So as for central bank digital currencies, chapters 5 and 6 of my book, minor plug in there, the case for and against.
Where's the book available?
Anywhere, at your finest bookseller and on Amazon as well.
Amazon.com, under Eswar Prasad.
So Dr. Wright correctly pointed out that the notion that people on the streets of El Salvador are going out and buying fruit or whatever with Bitcoin is not quite right. But I think if you look at what El Salvador is trying to do, it's similar to what corrupt despots in many countries are trying to do, which is, first of all, try to get away from the US dollar. So El Salvador has had a failing government. It got rid of its currency a while ago, had to adopt dollars. It's trying to reintroduce its currency. Venezuela has a failing currency. I think they're trying to, first of all, find a way in which they can ride the Bitcoin wave, because if you issue your own cryptocurrency or perhaps accumulate stores of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoins, maybe that is your way to fiscal and financial salvation, and potentially also a way, as Dr. Wright alluded, to get around financial sanctions, especially if you happen to be among the economic elite of a country. So this is not an experiment that's going to end particularly well. I don't think something like Bitcoin in particular is going to work terribly well as a transactional currency. And if these countries really believe that this is the way to get around the fact that they have failing governments and don't have very well-disciplined policies, that's not really going to work.
George, any reaction to El Salvador and Bitcoin?
Well, I don't think the government currencies have a prayer in the long run. They, of course, the long run is a hedge, but now Bitcoin settles in 10 minutes. There's $8 trillion a day, 25 times world GDP, settles in 3 days, 5 days, 10 days. It's a broken system. which feeds a vast financial maw around the globe. And it's a lie, because it doesn't tell the truth about transactions in time. And so Bitcoin, the blockchain, will prevail, because it's not slightly better, it's thousands of times better. The existing system isn't anywhere near the truth. It's debauching the world economy at the moment. We're being saved only by the continued brilliant improvisations of entrepreneurs around the globe advancing technology. But without that, this financial system would be totally feckless and failed. And so we've got a huge opportunity. We can create a new ground state for the internet and a new ground state for the global economy.
Yeah, grounded with transactions in time, right? Because it is about time. Rafael, let's go back in time for a moment as we start to wrap this up, which is, where do you think Bitcoin went so wrong? And why do you think it's so misunderstood, especially with BTC, as you described before?
Well, I think the usurpers of Bitcoin, they use libertarian, anarcho-capitalist rhetoric to get their job done. And so those, again, I'm going to repeat myself, those that were the most honest of that bunch, that saw the need for there to be a escape hatch away from tyranny, they went off to create CryptoNote, which now is Monero, and now we have other cryptocurrencies that are private by default at the protocol level. And I know Craig Wright doesn't agree with that, but they have that intrinsic need to respond to how to react against a tyrannical government. Democide was the #1 killer of human beings throughout all of history. That's death by government. So there is that intrinsic need that human beings have of having to have that escape hatch. And that desire was abused, and Bitcoin was then, the co-op attempt within Bitcoin was something that used that desire to confuse people. And now we ended up having this really weird thing. I call it cripple coin, which is BTC, or Bitcoin Cash, which is another version of cripple coin. But Bitcoin in its original design addresses a way bigger issue. It's not, and this is it's misunderstood. It's that, honestly, guys, I think Bitcoin was divinely inspired. Ask me, I don't know. The way I see it, that's just the way I see it. It's such a big deal and so misunderstood.
Craig,
that,
Craig, were you divinely inspired?
The best thing for us is to be humble and constantly learn of it more.
Well, I have got a doctorate in theology.
Yeah, Craig does have a doctorate in theology. Well, don't answer that question. We'll save that for another time, We'll see you go praying outside and see if you get some more divine inspiration.
But there's no little halos there, trust me.
No, there's definitely not a halo on your head, Craig. Definitely horns, not halo.
I try and be good, but I keep doing bad.
Tis true, Dr. Wright, tis true. So in our final moments here, now that we've trying to get Bitcoin back on track after all this time with BSV and scaling big, trying to build big data and payment utility across the world, I'll go to Eswar. What advice would you give to this BSV community here, as well as watching out in the world, the entrepreneurs, developers who want to build real businesses, because that is our mission, on a massively scalable blockchain? What advice would you give them to ensure that the blockchain we grow and its token have more real intrinsic value?
There is fundamental need, I think, for a better financial system. On this, certainly I will agree with George. The financial system doesn't work very well in serving the needs of a vast majority of the population. So I think products and services that meet this need and can do it more effectively through blockchain technology, using Bitcoin perhaps, I think have a real market there. So it's not going to be just a matter of coming up with snazzy new products, but ones that really meet genuine needs. But I think in that process, it's very important to keep in mind that maintaining the faith and trust of the investor community, the user community, is going to be important. And Bitcoin, in a sense, lends itself to that through its transparency. So I think the best thing you can do is realize that this tool that has been bequeathed to us from heaven, is really a powerful, really wonderful tool if used well.
Yeah. George, what advice would you give to the Bitcoin builders of BSV?
Well, I think that the challenge to Bitcoin is not most central bank currencies. It's the Chinese central bank currency based, digital currency based on blockchain and a national blockchain platform and an effort to create a Chinese Bitcoin for the world. That's the real competition. It's not this feckless $8 trillion currency trading carnival. It's a deliberate, dedicated effort to launch a new worldwide digital currency on the blockchain pushed by the Chinese people. And that's going to be, and unfortunately, the Chinese Communist Party. And that is, that combination is what the real competition is, if you want to, for Satoshi. That's who you got to beat, Craig.
Oh, the Chinese love him, though. Craig, I'll give you the last word. As we are getting ready to wrap this conference of 3 days of people watching around the world and here wanting to build on the original design that you gave to the world, what would you encourage them to do?
Build. So we've got this thing that doesn't compete with banks the way that people think. Bitcoin isn't a bank. It's digital cash.
That's right.
Now, that digital cash allows you, if you wanted to do tokenized other currencies, to do it, and do it fast and do it cheap. So as an example of something, if you want someone to be able to use Bitcoin directly and also help people, make something that allows them to switch back and forwards to, say, something like digital rupiah, so that people in India, say, in poverty, who earn less than $2 a day, don't need a bank. Because what they can do is form their own groups for saving. They can control their own money. They don't need to worry about being paid that way. Allow them to be paid not with cash systems. Like even here in America, there are cash exchange systems for checks. People get paid because they don't have bank accounts in checks, and then they lose sometimes 15% of their money. The poorest people here lose 15% of their money because they don't get cash. Build an app that gives them cash. Make it pegged to US dollars. Make it pegged to rupiah. Right now, that doesn't matter. Build it so that they can start spending their own money and not pay transaction fees that are huge, not 3% on MasterCard, a fraction of a cent. Because those several billion people matter. And to sit there like in the past Samson Mao did and went, Bitcoin's not for anyone under $2 a day, fuck you. That simple. I mean, yes, it is. Those people fucking matter. And I'll swear on this one. So build something for them.
It's about time.
It's about time. On that note, I want to thank our panelists, Rafael, George, Eswar, thank you for coming, and of course, Dr. Craig S. Wright. Let's give them another round of applause.
Financial slavery is a bitch because it doesn't let you think. That's the whole point. Don't give you time to think. If you want to really learn philosophy, you need leisure. Leisure. Crypto is here to give you the leisure so you can think.